Over 3.1 million Americans watched it live, but only a few truly understood what happened. In front of the bright lights, a clapping crowd, and a world hungry for entertainment, Ellen DeGeneres smiled and called Congresswoman Jasmine Crockett's fierce conviction, attitude. The audience laughed, the cameras rolled, but Jasmine didn't flinch. What she said next didn't just silence the studio, it rippled through living rooms, classrooms, and courtrooms across the country. In just 3 sentences, a comedy show turned into a national reckoning. Because the truth is, when a black woman speaks plainly and powerfully, she's not celebrated. She's often mocked, edited, or erased. This story, though dramatized for narrative impact, reflects a reality too many still live with. The names, dialogue, and setting have been reimagined, but the emotions, the injustice, and the quiet war behind every public smile, that part is painfully real, and it deserves to be felt. So ask yourself, why does a woman have to hold her breath just to hold her ground? And what happens when she finally refuses? It was 2:16 p.m. on a Thursday when the email arrived. Not the kind of email that screamed urgency or danger, just a subject line sitting quietly at the top of Jasmine Crockett's inbox, like a seed waiting to be noticed. The Ellen DeGeneres Show appearance request, confidential. Talia Brooks, Jasmine's chief of staff and longtime confidant, had paused when she saw it. Her screen was already cluttered with policy drafts, constituent updates, and a reminder to prep for next week's House Judiciary hearing. But this was different. Talia stared at it, one eyebrow raised. Was it real? A prank? A trap? 3 doors down, Jasmine was deep into a closed-door meeting on criminal justice reform. She sat at the head of the table, halfway through an impassioned argument about sentencing disparity between powder and crack cocaine cases, citing data from 1996 and personal stories from her own district. Her voice was steady, urgent, but never frantic. Her tone was controlled, but everyone in the room knew it came from something deeper, a lifetime of witnessing how the system spoke 2 languages, one for those it served and one for those it survived. Talia didn't interrupt immediately. She waited until Jasmine paused to sip from a chipped Howard University mug. Then, without a word, she slid her phone across the table. Jasmine glanced down, furrowed her brow slightly, then leaned back in her chair. "Ellen," she said aloud. The room fell quiet, hushed air. No one was sure if it was a question or a challenge. "Huh," Jasmine murmured again, half to herself. "That's, unexpected." One of the junior aides cleared his throat, unsure if he should keep taking notes or wait for a cue. No cue came. Talia's voice was low, almost cautious. "You think it's a good idea?" Jasmine didn't answer right away. She didn't need to. Everyone at that table knew the implications. Ellen's show wasn't C-SPAN or MSNBC, or one of those Sunday morning circuits with polite interruptions and a scrolling Chiron. Ellen's studio was a stage, a place where things were softened, where politics was background music and smiles were currency. And Jasmine Crockett, unapologetic, unfiltered, and deeply political, didn't do background. But that was the thing. This wasn't just a stage. It was the stage. Millions of Americans, most of whom didn't follow congressional hearings or read bills before breakfast, tuned into Ellen while folding laundry or fixing lunch. It wasn't just a talk show. It was a pulpit disguised as a party. And the question wasn't, should Jasmine go? The question was, what did they want her for? Her eyes flicked back to the email preview. The wording was professional, polished, but something about it was too polished. A lighthearted sit-down with Congresswoman Crockett, touching on her viral moments and inspiring rise. Talia reread that line under her breath and frowned. "They want the clip," she said, "not the context." Jasmine leaned back, her fingers drumming the edge of her folder. She thought back to a moment 3 months earlier, a clip from a House oversight hearing where she'd confronted a senior official about racial profiling. She hadn't raised her voice, hadn't even stood up, but one finger raised, one unflinching stare, and the internet turned her into a meme. "Don't test Texas." The moment went viral, but the policy she was defending barely got a footnote. "They always want the heat," Jasmine whispered, "never the fire behind it." That line hung in the air, and yet she wasn't dismissing the idea. There was a flicker in her eye, not ego, but calculation. Maybe, just maybe, she could flip it. Use their platform, their edit, their polished couches and clap signs to bring something raw, something real, something they couldn't spin without revealing their own bias. Talia exhaled. We don't control the edit. You know that, right? Jasmine nodded. I know. She looked down at the email again. This time, she didn't blink. I also know who I am. She stood, quietly but firmly. The decision had been made. And somewhere, far from Washington, a stage was being swept, lights were being tested, and someone was already writing her introduction. Without knowing that she wasn't coming to be introduced, she was coming to interrupt. The flight to Los Angeles was silent, not in sound, but in spirit. Jasmine sat by the window of seat 2A, her tailored blazer folded over her lap like a shield. The hum of the engines was steady, the clouds below indifferent. Talia sat beside her, flipping through briefing notes on a tablet, but she could sense it. Jasmine wasn't reading. She wasn't sleeping either. She was rehearsing, not lines but intentions. Jasmine wasn't nervous. She was alert, and that was far more dangerous. They had done their homework. Talia had pulled up every political guest Ellen had hosted over the past 5 years. They watched clips late into the night, congressmen being charmed into soft sound bites, senators getting tepid applause after sanitized answers, even a presidential candidate awkwardly dancing because the audience needed a moment of joy. That was the pattern. Soften, smile, laugh on cue. But Jasmine didn't come to do soft. She came with truth, and truth in the wrong setting was sometimes treated like a hostile act. I've seen this show before, Jasmine murmured, still looking out the window. They want authenticity, but only if it fits inside a laugh track. Talia didn't reply. She didn't need to. They both understood what this was, a cultural tightrope, strung between exposure and exploitation. When they landed at LAX, a black town car was waiting. The driver, a chatty man in his 50s, greeted them with a grin. My daughter's freaking out that you're going to be on Ellen, he said as he pulled away from the curb. She said, that's the lady with the sharp tongue and the sharper suits. Jasmine gave a polite smile. Let's hope that combination still works. As they wound through palm-lined boulevards, a producer called to confirm arrival. Polite, professional, almost too much so. Jasmine had learned to recognize that tone, the kind that made you feel welcomed, but not entirely wanted. The studio was colder than expected. Not emotionally, literally cold. The kind of artificial chill designed to preserve makeup and nerves. Jasmine's green room was pristine. White roses on the vanity, 2 bottles of chilled water, and a fruit tray that looked untouched. But something felt rehearsed, curated, too perfect. Like the room wasn't there for her comfort, but for the illusion of it. 20 minutes later, the first producer arrived, a tall man in a cable-knit sweater with a voice like smooth jazz. He shook Jasmine's hand with practiced ease. We're thrilled you're here, he said. Ellen's been looking forward to this. The second producer, a woman with a sharp bob and clipboard, walked in and sized Jasmine up with her eyes before her smile caught up. You look bold, she said, then let out a quick laugh like she realized too late how it sounded. Talia, standing behind Jasmine, stiffened. Jasmine didn't blink. She means powerful, she said evenly. The woman's laugh turned into a cough. Of course. Yes, powerful. Jasmine let the silence hang. Not awkwardly, deliberately. Then she noticed something else. A production assistant walked in behind them and handed a stack of cue cards to the producer. Jasmine's eyes caught a glimpse of the top card. 3 words, scrawled in black marker. Attitude in Congress. Her stomach didn't drop, but her awareness sharpened. Backstage, a young intern handed her a bottle of water with both hands. She looked barely 20, visibly nervous. My mom follows everything you do, she whispered. Thank you for how you carry yourself. That, more than the roses or the tray or the cold air, meant something. Jasmine nodded gently. Tell your mom I heard her. Ellen still hadn't come down to greet her. Most guests got a handshake, a quick hello, a welcome to the set. Not her, not this time. Jasmine checked the time. 3:48 p.m. 10 minutes until showtime. Talia leaned over and whispered, "You feel that?" Jasmine didn't look up. "Yeah, like we're being tolerated, not invited." And that changed everything. Because when you walk into a room knowing you're not really wanted, you walk in ready. And when Jasmine Crockett walked onto that stage, she didn't bring a filter. She brought the truth. 10 minutes until the cameras rolled, the music swelled, and millions of Americans unknowingly tuned in for a moment that would change more than just an afternoon broadcast. Jasmine sat still on the small white couch in the green room. She wasn't scrolling. She wasn't practicing lines. She was calibrating. Every breath, every word, every micro expression, because she understood something many in that building didn't. For a black woman in America, especially one in politics, stillness wasn't passivity. It was precision. The knock came like a cue in a script. A young stage manager with a headset poked her head in, bright smile ready. "We're at 5 minutes, Congresswoman. We'll bring you to the curtain in 2. Talia stepped forward. "She'll be there." The door shut again, and for the first time in the entire day, Jasmine closed her eyes. She wasn't tired. She was centering. In that brief silence, memories surged. A town hall in South Dallas where a grieving mother clutched Jasmine's hand so tightly she left crescent marks in her palm. The Senate chamber where she stood toe-to-toe with a ranking member who called her too passionate to be taken seriously. The hallway where she once waited 2 hours just to get 15 seconds of floor time for a criminal justice amendment. And now, this stage, this studio, this setup. She opened her eyes. "They want to clip me," she said flatly. "They want the finger, the stare." The meme, Talia nodded slowly. "Then give them something they can't edit out." Jasmine cracked the faintest smile. "Noted." She stood up and walked to the full-length mirror, adjusted her collar, smoothed her lapel. A small gold pin shaped like the scales of justice gleamed on her jacket, gifted to her by a formerly incarcerated woman who now ran a legal clinic in Houston. Jasmine touched it, just briefly, then let her hands fall to her sides. A producer opened the door. "It's time." As they walked down the hallway toward the stage entrance, Jasmine scanned the walls. Framed photos of celebrities lined every inch, laughing, dancing, hugging Ellen. Comedians, actors, athletes. And right there, framed at eye level, was a photo of Michelle Obama mid-laugh, seated across from Ellen. Jasmine paused just for a second. Even she, Jasmine whispered, got teased about her arms. Talia was right behind her. They joke because they're afraid to face it straight. Jasmine nodded and kept walking. At the final curtain, Ellen finally appeared. No handshake, no welcome. Just a quick nod toward the floor manager and a clipped, "We good?" She didn't even make eye contact. The floor manager counted down. 5, 4. The band hit its upbeat jingle. 3, 2. Applause erupted on cue. 1. The curtain parted, and Jasmine Crockett walked out, not as a guest, as a reckoning. She didn't wave dramatically. She didn't milk the cheers. She simply walked, calm and centered, and took her seat across from Ellen. Legs crossed, chin level, hands folded in her lap like they were holding something the audience couldn't see. Ellen smiled wide. "Congresswoman Jasmine Crockett, welcome. You clean up nice." Jasmine returned the smile. Polite, controlled, measured. "I clean up every day," she said smoothly. "Congress just doesn't hand out makeup artists." Laughter, a few claps. The crowd loved it. But that line wasn't for them. It was for what came next. Because Jasmine hadn't come here to be liked. She had come here to be heard. The lights were bright, brighter than they looked on TV, and colder than anyone had warned. Jasmine sat just off stage as a makeup artist dabbed a puff of translucent powder along her jawline, muttering about de-shining the T-zone while never quite meeting her eyes. The woman's movements were mechanical, like she'd done this 1,000 times. But the difference was this time she wasn't prepping a celebrity here to sell a movie or dance to a cue. She was prepping someone who had come with no script, no gimmick, and no need to be charming. Jasmine's presence shifted the room, and everyone felt it, even if no one said a word. From the corner of her eye, Jasmine noticed a production assistant whispering something to a floor manager, both of them glancing in her direction and then looking quickly away. She knew that look. She'd seen it in Senate committee rooms, in courtrooms, in closed-door meetings where people talked over her, before realizing too late that she wasn't the one to be underestimated. This wasn't paranoia. It was pattern recognition. The green room hadn't calmed her earlier, and it wasn't meant to. White orchids, citrus-scented candles, and a cheese tray with 6 kinds of fruit didn't impress Jasmine Crockett. What caught her attention was how carefully controlled the environment was. Like everything in it had been pre-cleansed of discomfort. The roses were perfect, the bottled water was imported, but the space itself felt emotionally sterilized, like they wanted you to feel comfortable without ever getting too comfortable. A female producer entered the dressing area and approached with a well-practiced smile and clipboard in hand. Her eyes moved quickly, professionally, until they landed on Jasmine's lapel. "You look bold," she said with a half laugh, as if it had slipped out before she could stop herself. Talia, who stood quietly behind Jasmine near the mirror, cocked her head ever so slightly, not enough to be confrontational, just enough to signal she'd caught it. Jasmine didn't blink. She was used to code-switching compliments, decoding them faster than they were spoken. "She means powerful," Jasmine said, her voice neutral but firm, eyes never leaving the mirror. The producer's laugh cracked. "Of course! Yes, that's what I meant," she said too quickly, almost stumbling over her own correction. Then she mumbled something about timing and keeping it fun before backing out of the room like a guest who'd overstayed dinner. Jasmine reached for the water bottle beside her and took a slow sip, letting the silence hang. These weren't mistakes. These were patterns, little cracks in the veneer that revealed more than the show ever would. And it wasn't over. Another assistant appeared in the doorway, handed a new set of cue cards to the floor manager, and walked off without saying a word. But Jasmine caught it. The top card was barely hidden, and the bold black ink scrawled across it was unmistakable. Attitude in Congress. That word again. Attitude. Not leadership. Not conviction. Not clarity. Attitude. Jasmine's grip on the bottle tightened slightly, but her face remained unreadable. She didn't speak. She didn't need to. The room was saying everything already, and it wasn't just what they were planning to ask her. It was what they thought they already knew about her. Backstage, a young woman with a headset approached and offered Jasmine another bottle of water. Her voice was soft, different. "My mom watches your speeches on YouTube," she said, almost whispering. "She always says, 'You speak like you're carrying something heavier than the microphone.'" She paused, eyes wide. "Thank you for not softening it." That, Jasmine thought, was real. That moment, that girl, that sentiment. Not for ratings, not for entertainment, just someone who had recognized weight and refused to ask it to be lighter. Jasmine gave her a warm nod, the only genuine smile she'd shown in an hour. "Tell your mom she's seen." As the girl walked away, Talia leaned in and said under her breath, "They have no idea what they're about to get, do they?" Jasmine exhaled slowly, voice level. "No," she said. "They think I came to dance." She placed the water bottle down, adjusted the sleeve of her blazer, and rose from her chair with the same steady composure she used in floor debates and depositions. But this wasn't Congress. This wasn't a committee hearing. This was something else entirely. This was a room dressed up to look like fun and rigged to flatten the edge off truth. And Jasmine Crockett, she had no intention of letting them dull her down. Jasmine was led through a narrow hallway just behind the main studio, where the floor beneath her feet was painted black and the air carried the smell of hairspray and cold electronics. She walked past framed photographs of past guests, musicians mid-performance, actors pretending not to be nervous, politicians mid-laugh after a softball question. Every one of them was caught in a moment of perfect relatability, framed forever to suggest that being on this show was something to celebrate. But Jasmine didn't feel celebrated. She felt studied. The soundstage loomed ahead like a cathedral of curated charm. Bright panels pulsed gently with soft purple light. The crew moved like clockwork, efficient, smiling, and always just a little too cheery. Jasmine had seen this before. Not here, but in other places. Places where being welcomed and being managed were two very different things. She could feel it in the way a producer with wire-rimmed glasses named Nate walked toward her, extending his hand like a man greeting a house guest he secretly resented but publicly praised. "We're really excited to have you here," Nate said, his voice smooth, practiced. "Ellen's been looking forward to mixing in more serious voices. Give the audience something to chew on." Jasmine tilted her head slightly, not breaking eye contact. "I appreciate the invite," she said. "Just curious. Why now?" Nate laughed, caught off guard. "Well," he said, pushing his glasses up, "I think people are starting to realize you're not just a viral clip anymore." That wasn't a compliment, but he thought it was. Jasmine gave a half smile, the kind that didn't travel far. Beside her, Talia's lips tightened. "We just like to be sure the segment reflects Jasmine's real voice," Talia said calmly but firmly. "The full context, not just sound bites." Of course," Nate said, holding up both hands. "No gotchas. Ellen respects your work. But you know, she likes to keep it light. She may tease a little." "Teasing who I am?" Jasmine asked. She didn't raise her voice. She didn't need to. "Oh no," Nate backpedaled. "Just general stuff. Tone, passion, that kind of thing." Jasmine said nothing, but the silence wasn't empty. It was a response in itself, sharp and intentional. A line had just been drawn, and Nate knew it. He offered a strained smile and gestured toward the main curtain. "We're on in 5. As they walked the final stretch toward the stage entrance, the set lighting intensified. Every step forward felt like peeling away another layer of illusion. The closer Jasmine got, the more artificial everything looked. The glow of the faux skyline, the sheen of Ellen's white chair, the impossibly perfect gleam of the studio floor. It was a set dressed to look like home, but it was a home that didn't recognize her furniture. She passed by a portrait of another First Lady mid-laugh and paused again, this time just for a beat. Even Michelle, polished and beloved, hadn't been spared the jabs. Her arms, her eyebrows, her seriousness all turned into punchlines by people too afraid to say what they really meant. Jasmine wasn't Michelle, but she knew what it meant to be the one woman in the room who wasn't allowed to be anything other than warm, and she was done pretending. Talia walked beside her in silence until they reached the velvet curtain. Then, almost as an afterthought, she whispered, "They're expecting you to smile through it." Jasmine adjusted the button on her blazer and stared straight ahead. "Then they haven't done their homework." Behind the curtain, the floor manager gave a signal. The music cue began to build. 3 minutes. That was all the time left before the lights would flood her face, before the crowd would cheer on cue, and before Ellen would deliver her first line with a grin. Jasmine's heart didn't race. Her breath didn't quicken. Because this wasn't new. This wasn't entertainment. This was survival. Polished, scheduled, live-streamed. And Jasmine Crockett had every intention of rewriting the script. The air behind the curtain wasn't just cold. It was still, like the moment before a match is lit. The crew moved with the quiet intensity of people who had done this 1,000 times. And yet everyone seemed just a little too precise. The way the floor manager tapped her earpiece 3 times instead of 2. The way the lighting tech adjusted a bulb no one had complained about. The way the stagehand with the cue card stole one more glance at Jasmine before stepping off to the side. Something was off, not wrong, just watched, curated, as if the moment already knew it would be remembered and the room was bracing for it. Jasmine stood just inside the black curtain, her heels resting on the red tape that marked her entry point. She could hear Ellen on the other side, warming up the audience with casual banter, something about puppies and bad dancing. The laughter was light, timed, and enthusiastic. The kind of laughter that came not from surprise, but permission. Jasmine didn't move. She kept her arms at her sides, her posture tall but fluid, grounded, like a courtroom litigator who had already chosen not just her first sentence, but the rhythm of her final one. She didn't need a script. She was the script. Talia hovered 2 feet behind her, saying nothing, doing nothing, except watching. She knew Jasmine's tells. She had seen her in front of committees where every member voted against her amendment before she even spoke. Had watched her endure press briefings where reporters asked how she managed to stay so composed after being interrupted 5 times in 3 minutes. But this was different. This wasn't legislative war. This was showtime dressed like softness. It was charm as shield. It was a comedy stage trying to wrap itself around a woman who had made her career by refusing to be folded. Just then, Nate, the same producer who'd offered her that surface-level welcome, reappeared, leaned slightly toward Jasmine, and said with a half grin, "Hey, remember, it's all about having fun out there." Jasmine turned her head only slightly. "For who?" she asked, her tone quiet but surgical. He didn't answer. He smiled again and backed away like someone dodging a wire. Behind the curtain, Ellen's voice rose. "All right, everyone, let's welcome a congresswoman who's gone viral more times than my dancing. Jasmine Crockett." Applause erupted. Loud, long, well fed by the blinking clap sign just above the audience's heads. The music swelled. The band played her in, and then Jasmine walked. One step, then another, then another. Calm, centered. Nothing theatrical, no overplayed wave, no wide smile. Just presence, just her. A woman in a space that wasn't built for her, taking up all the air the stage would allow without asking permission. She moved like someone who understood that performance wasn't a suit she had to put on, but a skin she'd already shed. Ellen stood with open arms and her signature grin. "Congresswoman Crockett," she beamed. "You clean up nice." The audience chuckled. A few even cheered. Jasmine took her seat with poise, uncrossed and recrossed her legs, and returned Ellen's smile. Not wide, not fake. Controlled. Then delivered the line like it had been waiting months to be said. "I clean up every day," she said. "Congress just doesn't hand out makeup artists." Laughter again, this time warmer. It rippled through the crowd like a wave breaking against something solid. But Jasmine wasn't playing. That line wasn't for applause. It was the first scalpel. And Ellen didn't realize yet. The temperature had just shifted. The room didn't know it. The audience didn't feel it. But behind that smile, behind those bright lights and soft edges, something had just moved beneath the surface. Because Jasmine hadn't come to fit the moment. She had come to change it. The interview began the way they always do, soft. Ellen leaned in with her signature smile, and a tone so light it nearly floated off the armrest. She asked Jasmine about growing up in Texas, about switching from criminal defense to politics, about what she does to de-stress after heated hearings. Jasmine played along, calm, articulate, letting the answers breathe just enough to stay real but never too long to be edited mid-sentence. The crowd clapped on cue, laughed when prompted. It was smooth, easy, almost suspiciously so. But Jasmine knew the real question was coming, and when it did, it came with a grin. "So," Ellen said, crossing one leg over the other, "let's talk about that famous clip. You know the one. When you really gave it to that committee guy. I mean, that attitude." She smirked as she raised one hand and mimicked Jasmine's finger wave. "My staff watches that every Monday. Gets us fired up." The crowd laughed, delighted. Some clapped. It was the kind of laughter that wasn't cruel, but wasn't innocent either. It was the sound of people being entertained by something they didn't fully understand. And in that split second, Jasmine saw it, saw herself reduced to a meme in real time. The audience didn't know her argument, didn't know what she was defending, didn't know the bill or the stakes or the silence she had been answering with her voice. They only knew the clip, the finger, the fire, the attitude. Jasmine didn't laugh. She straightened in her seat and placed her hands calmly on her lap. The room didn't notice the shift at first. It was too subtle. But the cameras caught it. The audio picked it up, and the air, once breezy, grew denser. "I've noticed something," Jasmine said softly, her voice not rising, but deepening in tone. "When men speak directly, they're called assertive. When women speak directly, we're called emotional. And when Black women do it, it suddenly becomes attitude." The room hushed, not dramatically, not all at once, but like someone had turned down the volume just enough to make people listen harder. Ellen blinked. A few audience members adjusted in their seats. The applause sign didn't blink. The laughter didn't return. Something had entered the room that wasn't on the cue cards. Jasmine continued, her tone steady but cutting. Is it passionate? Sure, because I'm defending people who've been ignored. Is it expressive? Absolutely, because silence never protected my district. But calling that attitude, that's not playful. That's dismissive. Ellen opened her mouth, but no sound came out. For a beat, no one moved. Then Ellen let out a quick laugh. Tight, shallow, the kind people use to fill space. Well, she said, forcing lightness into her voice, I didn't mean anything by it. You know I love a strong woman. I married one. A few audience members chuckled nervously, but Jasmine didn't break eye contact. I'm sure you do, she said. Her voice wasn't angry. It wasn't cold. It was clean. But loving strong women doesn't mean you get to reduce their power to a punchline. Ellen's smile faltered, not collapsed, just cracked at the corners. This wasn't going how she expected. And the room, this curated, cushioned, studio-lit room, felt it. Behind the cameras, a stagehand pressed a hand to her headset. In the control booth, a director muttered, Do we cut to commercial? Another voice answered, Not yet. Let it roll. Because everyone knew something was happening, something real. Jasmine hadn't shouted. She hadn't leaned forward. She hadn't performed. But she had just turned a comedy stage into a courtroom, and her opening statement had left the audience speechless. Jasmine let the silence settle, not because she needed to collect herself, she didn't, but because silence, when held deliberately, becomes a weapon sharper than any raised voice. She'd learned that long ago, in rooms where she was the only black woman present, where raising her voice would be met with suspicion and restraint, but stillness could force the room to reveal itself. And now, in front of millions, she was wielding that stillness with the precision of someone who had practiced not being heard for most of her career. I want to ask something, she said, turning just slightly to face the audience, her posture still upright, still elegant. Why is it that we, as black women, are expected to laugh along when people poke fun at our tone, our delivery, our expression, like we're supposed to be in on the joke even when the joke's on us? She didn't look at Ellen. She didn't need to. I didn't come here to be funny. I came here to be heard. That one sentence cracked the room open. There was no sound, no music bed, no applause sign, not even the rustle of someone shifting in their seat. The silence wasn't accidental. It was stunned, unsure, but not hostile. People weren't pulling away. They were leaning in. Jasmine continued, her voice unwavering. You know what happens when someone calls me passionate? I get told it's a compliment. When they say I have attitude, it's usually followed by a warning, spoken or not. It's a reminder that I've entered a space I wasn't invited into, and that the volume of my voice, not the content, is what makes people uncomfortable. A woman in the third row, mid-50s with a silver bob, and her hands clutched around her purse, nodded slowly, eyes locked on Jasmine. On the far side, a younger man had stopped, smiling, now blinking rapidly like someone watching a scene he couldn't look away from. Even Ellen, who was usually masterful at redirecting discomfort with humor, seemed frozen, not afraid but disarmed, like a boxer who had just realized the opponent wasn't there to spar. I've been in rooms where the only way I was allowed to speak was if I dulled myself down, smiled more, nodded even when I disagreed, softened my truth so it wouldn't sound like conflict, Jasmine said, and now she turned back to face Ellen fully. But I won't shrink myself for someone else's comfort. That was it. The shift was complete. No one laughed, no one clapped, but the entire tone of the room had been rewritten. Ellen, caught mid-breath, attempted to regain control. Look, I was just referencing what's already online. You know, the viral stuff. People love that clip. It's empowering. I know what they love, Jasmine said gently, but without retreat. They love the sound of someone standing up for themselves. But sometimes what goes viral isn't what's most valuable. That sentence hit differently. Because it wasn't angry, it was reflective. Because it wasn't combative, it was truthful. And truth in a setting built for applause lines and harmless punchlines has a way of making everything feel suddenly, uncomfortably real. Ellen's smile was there, but faint, like the light from a lamp that had just flickered. That's fair, she said quietly, her tone absent its usual buoyancy. Jasmine didn't smile back. She didn't need to, because the crowd didn't need to be told what had just happened. They had felt it. They had watched a woman remain entirely composed and still shift the gravity of the room. They had watched a setup turn into a stand. And they had seen something even rarer, a moment on television that hadn't been planned, rehearsed, or packaged for comfort, but had been delivered with clarity, power, and absolute grace. There was something heavy in the air now, not the weight of discomfort, but of undeniable awareness. It hung over the studio like a storm cloud without thunder, just pressure. Not hostile, not theatrical, just still. The audience sat in a kind of suspended quiet, their hands mid-rest on their laps, unsure whether to clap or stay silent, as if any reaction would either betray complicity or break something sacred that had just been laid bare. And Jasmine, still sitting upright, legs crossed, hands steady, held the silence like a conductor holding the final note of a symphony that wasn't written to entertain, but to awaken. She didn't speak right away. She didn't need to. The moment was breathing on its own now, pulsing with the kind of energy you don't usually see on daytime television. Truth that refused to be softened. She let that energy linger for another beat, then leaned forward, not with aggression, but with intent. "You invited me here to talk," she said, voice still calm, still centered. "So let's actually talk. Not just about the moments that went viral. Let's talk about why those moments happened in the first place. Why I had to speak that way to be taken seriously in a room full of men who didn't want to hear me until I raised my voice." That sentence broke the silence just enough for the audience to finally respond. Not with roars or ovations, but with a small, steady wave of clapping. Not all of them. Just enough to make the air feel like it shifted from tension to something closer to clarity. The applause wasn't loud, but it was honest. The kind that came not from showmanship, but from shared recognition. A few heads nodded, a few eyes glistened. One woman in the second row wiped her cheek quickly, pretending it was just an itch. Ellen nodded stiffly, fingers grazing her signature coffee mug. "So," she asked, quieter now, "you're saying you don't regret it?" Jasmine tilted her head slightly, then answered with the same precision she brought to the house floor. "I don't regret being heard," she said. "I regret that I had to fight that hard just to be treated like an equal." And just like that, the studio wasn't a stage anymore. It was a mirror, one that reflected not just Jasmine's clarity, but the system's discomfort. Ellen didn't respond right away. She sat back, hands folded in her lap, her usual armor of charisma now noticeably thinner. For a flicker of a second, she looked smaller, not humiliated, not defeated, but humbled. And in that humbling, a strange thing happened. The power in the room shifted, not with noise, but with stillness. Talia, watching from the wings, recognized it before anyone else. The energy, the balance, the moment. It wasn't dramatic. There was no walk-off, no shouting match, no gotcha. But there didn't need to be. Jasmine had done something rare. She had held her space, held it without apology. And in doing so, she had redefined the entire conversation, not by overpowering Ellen, but by refusing to play by the rules of soft deflection and scripted charm. Jasmine leaned back slightly in her seat, not smug, not defensive, just grounded. "Respect," she said gently, "isn't about volume. It's about whether people stop talking long enough to listen. And if they listen only when I'm loud, that says more about the room than it does about me." No one clapped this time. No one had to. The silence was no longer awkward. It was acknowledgement, the kind that settled deep, not just in the studio, but somehow through the lens, into the homes of people watching live, into offices where women had been told to smile more, into classrooms where young Black girls had been labeled disruptive, into boardrooms, break rooms, living rooms, any room where the sound of a woman speaking clearly had once been met with a wince instead of respect. And Jasmine knew that from here forward, everything would be different, not because of what she said, but because of how clearly she refused to be edited. The applause sign blinked one last time. The music faded. The studio lights dimmed slightly as the segment cut to commercial, and with that, the illusion of performance collapsed. The moment the red recording light on the main camera shut off, it was as if the room exhaled for the first time in 10 minutes. Ellen leaned back in her chair and reached for her mug as if grasping for something to ground her. The laughter had stopped, not just because the cameras had, but because no one could quite figure out what emotion they were supposed to return to. Was it relief? Was it discomfort? Was it respect? The answers hung unspoken in the air. Jasmine didn't rise immediately. She sat quietly, her hands still folded in her lap, eyes fixed ahead. Not in defiance, not in victory, but in presence. The kind of presence that makes people question whether what they just saw was spontaneous or surgical. She could feel it happening already. Producers whispering behind the curtain, stage hands shifting nervously, the lighting tech resetting the board as if a power outage had occurred. And in a way it had. Ellen leaned forward, trying to reclaim familiarity. "That was intense," she said with a laugh too light to land. "But good TV, right?" Jasmine looked at her for a moment, not coldly, not cruelly, just clearly. Then she stood, calmly, adjusted the crease of her blazer, and walked off the stage with footsteps that echoed louder than the final applause. Each click of her heel across the polished floor was a statement, not of arrogance, but of authority reclaimed. She didn't flinch. She didn't look back. She didn't need to. Backstage, the hallway felt narrower than before, as if the building itself had become aware of what had just unfolded within it. An assistant appeared, holding a bottle of water and a clipboard, but didn't make eye contact. A junior producer whispered something into a headset, eyes darting from Jasmine to the screen in the control room, where the playback had already started rolling without sound. People were watching her in silence, not out of admiration, not out of fear, but out of recalibration. Like they were suddenly unsure what kind of guest she had been. Was she difficult, dangerous, or just different? Talia caught up with her halfway down the corridor. "You okay?" she asked, voice low but steady. Jasmine took the water, opened it without a word, and took a single sip before answering. "I'm always okay," she said quietly. "That's the part they don't see." They walked in silence to the green room, where the earlier warmth had dissipated. The roses on the vanity were still perfect. The fruit tray remained untouched. But the energy had shifted. It was no longer decorative. It was defensive, like a space preparing for damage control. Jasmine sat down slowly on the small leather couch, crossed one leg over the other, and checked her phone. 28 messages. Her sister, 3 Hill staffers, 2 reporters she hadn't spoken to in over a year, and one name she didn't expect to see flashing on her lock screen. Glenda Ruiz. Talia was already scrolling through notifications. "Twitter's on fire," she said. "You're trending in 3 cities. The words attitude, respect, and Jasmine Crockett are in the same sentence on every platform." Jasmine didn't flinch. She simply leaned her head back and closed her eyes for a moment, letting the weight of it all land, but not break her. Then just as calmly, she spoke. Let it breathe. That was her entire strategy. Not to post, not to double down, not to defend what needed no defense. Silence, not as retreat, but as refusal to explain what should have been obvious. In that silence, she knew the story would grow legs longer than any soundbite. It would be clipped, captioned, rewatched, and reframed by voices she didn't control. But the truth had already been spoken, and there was no taking it back. By the time Jasmine and Talia had left the building, the sun had already dipped low over Los Angeles. The studio lot glowed under security lights, casting long shadows over a handful of lingering crew members and silent assistants pretending to check their phones. But inside the world of the internet, the night was anything but quiet. On Twitter, the clip had already been sliced and posted, 3 different angles, 2 audio-enhanced versions, and a dozen captions ranging from triumphant to explosive. She didn't raise her voice. She raised the standard, read one post from a college student in Missouri, already shared 15,000 times in less than an hour. Another said, when Ellen tried to make her a joke, Jasmine Crockett gave her a lesson instead. Talia sat across from Jasmine in the backseat of the car, phone in hand, thumbs moving rapidly as she scanned mentions and quotes. 3 trending hashtags. She's respect black women, Sure, you're Crockett won Ellen, and my personal favorite, Mick checkmate. Jasmine gave a small smile, but said nothing. She stared out the tinted window as Los Angeles blurred by. Billboards, palm trees, brake lights, and wondered how many people were watching that clip right now, not because they wanted entertainment, but because they saw themselves in that moment. A woman who did not perform, who did not adjust, who did not dilute. A woman who refused to make herself smaller for the sake of decorum. Jasmine didn't answer. She was staring at her phone again, where the Twitter app sat open. Notifications were still rolling in, like a faucet she had no intention of shutting off. Her fingers hovered over the tweet button. Talia noticed and paused. "You thinking of posting something?" she asked. Jasmine considered it for a second, just long enough for the moment to be real. Then she shook her head. Number not yet. Instead, she opened the Notes app again and typed out a single sentence. Visibility means nothing if it demands your silence. She didn't tweet it, didn't caption it, didn't watermark it with a brand logo or set it in bold type for viral impact. She just let it sit, unpublished, unpolished, but perfect in its clarity. That was her entire approach. Let the truth stand on its own feet. Don't chase the echo. Don't dilute the moment just to shape the reaction. Let people be uncomfortable. Let them wrestle. Let the reflection stretch long enough to sting. Because Jasmine understood something too many in public life forget. Sometimes the most powerful message is the one you don't force, don't shout, don't even post. Sometimes it's the message that lingers precisely because it was withheld, because you trusted the silence to carry what needed no further translation. And that, above all, is what made her dangerous. She didn't need the last word. She already had the final say. 3 weeks later, in a modest recreation center gym in Tulsa, Oklahoma, Jasmine stood on a low wooden riser that served as a makeshift stage. The basketball hoops had been raised to the ceiling, folding chairs lined the scuffed hardwood floor, and the only backdrop was a hand-painted banner reading, "Community Town Hall. Listen. Learn. Lead." There were no cameras, no teleprompters, just rows of local families, educators, veterans, single mothers, and in the back corner, a girl who looked like she hadn't blinked since Jasmine started speaking. Her name was Alondra. She was 15, tall for her age, her long box braids pulled into a careful bun. She clutched a notebook to her chest as if afraid the words might fall out. Jasmine had been answering a question about education funding when the moderator noticed her hand raised. Slowly, nervously, but unwavering. The mic was passed back, one chair at a time, until it reached her trembling fingers. She stood before she spoke. That simple gesture made the entire room quiet. "Hi," she said, barely above a whisper. "My name is Alondra." Jasmine offered a small smile from the stage. "Hey, Alondra," she replied gently. "You're doing great." The girl's hands shook slightly, but her voice found just enough strength to continue. I, um, I watched you on Ellen." A few heads in the room turned. Some smiled, some nodded in quiet recognition. Jasmine's smile deepened just a little. "I never saw anyone talk like that on TV before," Alondra said. "You didn't get mad. You just said what it was." There was a stillness in the room again, not tense, not strained, just present, focused. Alondra's voice trembled. "Last week in class, I got called too loud. The teacher said my tone was aggressive, but I was just answering the question. I didn't mean anything by it. It made me feel small, like I should just stop talking." Jasmine's smile faded, not in disappointment, but in understanding. She knew that tone, that memory, that ache, but she didn't rush to fill the silence. She let Alondra finish. "But when I saw you," Alondra said, eyes wet now, "it made me feel like maybe I don't have to change how I talk." A few people clapped gently, others just nodded, visibly moved. But Jasmine raised her hand softly to keep the focus on the girl, not the moment. She stepped down from the stage, slowly, deliberately, her heels soft against the wood, and walked toward Alondra, not to make a scene, but to close the space. When she reached her, she didn't reach for the mic. She didn't ask for applause. She simply looked her in the eye and said, just loud enough for the room to hear, but quiet enough that it felt like a secret being returned. Let me tell you something. Your voice doesn't need fixing. Alondra's shoulders shook slightly. This world wasn't built to handle your volume, Jasmine continued, her hand gently on the girl's shoulder. So they'll call it too much, but it's not. They'll tell you to shrink, to soften, to sound less certain so they can stay comfortable. But don't ever confuse their discomfort with your value. The room was silent, not out of pity, out of power. No applause, no standing ovation, just presence. And in that presence, Jasmine knew this was why the moment on Ellen mattered. Not for the ratings, not for the clips, but for this. A 15-year-old girl in a corner chair deciding, right then, not to quiet herself, not to apologize for her tone, not to erase her fire, because someone else had refused to do it first. The event wound down slowly, as these things often did, not with a grand finale or official ending, but with people quietly rising from their chairs, gathering their coats, exchanging glances that carried more meaning than words. Jasmine stood near the makeshift podium, speaking with a group of local educators when she noticed a figure moving steadily toward her. He walked with intention, though age had added a slight lean to his stride. A worn corduroy blazer hugged his shoulders, and a gray flat cap rested gently on his head. His pace was slow, but there was something unshakably composed about him. Like he'd walked through years most people only read about. When he reached her, he didn't introduce himself. He didn't need to. His presence carried the weight of someone who had lived enough life to know when it was better to listen than to speak. Jasmine turned toward him instinctively, and for a second they simply looked at each other. 2 generations, 2 fights, same storm. Then without a word, the old man reached out and took her hand. Not quickly, not weakly, but deliberately. His grip was steady, warm, and full of something that felt like history folded into silence. "You didn't raise your voice," he said finally, his tone raspy but whole. "But you raised our bar." Jasmine didn't respond right away. The words hit her in a place that didn't know how to be loud. Not pride, not victory, just something truer. She gave a small nod, the kind you offer when thank you doesn't feel like enough. The man's eyes stayed on hers for a moment longer. Then he released her hand and walked away without another word. Talia, watching from across the room, approached slowly. "Who was that?" Jasmine exhaled. No idea, but she did know. Not his name, not his title, not his story. But she knew what he represented. He was the man who had once marched instead of tweeted, who had spoken from pulpits in towns where sheriffs watched from the back pew, who had witnessed promises made and broken in the same election cycle, who had heard the words, "wait your turn," more times than he could count. And yet he still showed up, still listened, still believed that raising the bar didn't have to mean raising the volume. That handshake said everything. It said, "I've seen many people speak loudly and say nothing, but you said everything without needing to raise your tone." It said, "We tried our way, and you found yours, and both matter." It said, "I won't be here forever, but I'm glad someone like you is." Jasmine sat down slowly on the edge of the stage, heels dangling just above the gym floor. The echo of Alondra's voice was still playing in her mind, tangled now with the old pastor's words. Different voices, different generations, but the same rhythm beneath them. Don't shrink, don't perform, just stand. That's what this was. That's what the Ellen moment had become. Not a viral clapback, but a shift in posture that rippled outward and hit places no trending topic ever could. She glanced around the room one last time. A teacher hugging a student, a young father nodding quietly to himself, a janitor stacking chairs a little slower than necessary, as if staying in that room a moment longer somehow mattered. This wasn't just a town hall anymore. It had become a transmission, a quiet passing of something generational. And she hadn't planned for that. She hadn't gone into that studio to make a statement that would end up echoing across middle schools and veterans groups and living rooms in Tulsa. She had simply refused to bend, and somehow that had given others permission to stand. Back in Washington, the tone had changed. It didn't happen overnight, not with a press release, not with a viral roundtable, but with something quieter, more persistent. Jasmine could feel it before she saw it. The way certain journalists stopped cutting her off mid-sentence. The way morning talk show producers, who once labeled her too intense for soft segments, now reached out with open hands and nervous emails, suddenly eager to explore new narratives. Even the way photographers at Capitol Hill press scrums began asking her to stand in the center instead of cropping her to the edge of the frame. It was subtle, but Jasmine noticed. She always noticed. At first, she ignored it. She had no interest in cosmetic redemption. She didn't trust quick pivots. Respect that shows up after the crowd claps is not the kind she was raised to count on. But it was there nonetheless, a sudden elevation in the way her name appeared in headlines, her image used in campaign ads, her words cited in speeches by people who wouldn't have returned her call 6 months earlier. Some of it was sincere, most of it was survival. The media, as always, knew how to chase a shift once it had momentum. Back inside the studio, the control room was spinning. Producers whispered in circles. Editors reviewed footage. One junior writer Googled "crisis management daytime TV" in another tab while trying to rewrite the episode description for the next day's syndication. Ellen was pacing in her private dressing room, sipping cold tea and rehashing the moment for the fifth time with her senior producer, Nate. "That wasn't supposed to go viral like that," she muttered, more annoyed than shaken. Nate, who had once said Jasmine was not just a viral clip anymore, now realized just how little control they had over the ripple they had started. Back in the car, Talia kept scanning. Newsweek already picked it up. So did Vox. CNN has a headline up. Crockett confronts tone policing on national stage. And, she paused, eyes narrowing, there's already a segment scheduled tomorrow on The View. They're calling it "The Moment We All Felt Seen." Jasmine raised an eyebrow but still said nothing. Talia continued, reading from the screen. Congresswoman Jasmine Crockett's appearance on Ellen has ignited a national conversation on racial double standards, respectability politics, and the power of stillness in public confrontation. That was the word that kept coming up. Stillness. Not clap back, not shut down, not take down. Stillness. The choice not to fight with volume, but with control. Not with force, but with clarity. Jasmine didn't respond to any of it. She didn't repost. She didn't quote tweet the clips, didn't issue a follow-up statement, didn't explain her tone, her words, or her intention. She let the moment breathe because moments like that needed space to grow and oxygen to become something no algorithm could contain. Talia looked up from her phone. "They're waiting for you to say something." Jasmine didn't turn from the window. "Good," she said after a beat. "Let them." And it was true. Across the country, viewers were waiting. Commentators were scripting monologues. Op-eds were already halfway done. Some were praising her. Others were carefully crafting ways to say she had made Ellen uncomfortable without sounding biased. But the more the world reacted, the clearer it became that Jasmine didn't need to respond. The point had already been made, not just in words, but in poise, in presence, in the silence that followed. She wasn't trending because she shouted. She was trending because she didn't. And in a culture trained to react to volume, that kind of control was a shockwave. By the time Jasmine returned to her hotel room, the walls of the internet had already shifted. Headlines were no longer asking what she said. They were analyzing why it struck so deeply. Some outlets praised her masterful poise. Others described the moment as a cultural reset. A few tried to tame it by calling it a miscommunication between two strong women, attempting to wrap the rawness in packaging soft enough to forget. But Jasmine didn't read any of it. She didn't need to. She'd felt the shift happen in real time, heard it in the silence after her words, saw it in the stillness of a crowd conditioned to laugh on command, but left frozen instead. That was enough. She sat on the edge of the bed, blazer still on, heels still buckled, scrolling quietly through the messages flooding her phone. Staffers, colleagues, journalists, a handful of names she hadn't seen since law school. Many of the messages were brief, just clips and emojis. Others came with paragraphs of reflection. But one caught her eye and made her stop mid-scroll. It was from Glenda Ruiz, a retired postal worker from Santa Fe, New Mexico. The message was only a single line. "For the first time, I saw someone on daytime TV who didn't shrink to make others feel bigger." Jasmine read it again. Then a third time. She didn't reply, didn't like it, didn't forward it to Talia. She simply copied the sentence into her notes app and let it sit there, like a truth that didn't need an audience to be valid. That one message said more than the thousands of shares, the trending hashtags, or the televised commentary, because it came not from the spectacle, but from the stillness. Not from the people applauding, but from someone who had been waiting, watching for someone like her to stop apologizing for her space. Talia knocked once and entered the room, laptop in one hand, a bottle of ginger tea in the other. "We've got 3 new interview requests," she said, setting the tea down. "MSNBC wants you tomorrow. Joy Reid's team said they'll shift segments to fit you in, and someone from The View is asking if you'll reconsider that panel next week." Jasmine raised an eyebrow. "Didn't they say I was too tense for morning television?" Talia smirked. "Apparently now you're too commanding not to include." Talia kept track of the surge. "NPR just added you to their Voices to Watch series," she said one morning over coffee. "Washington Post wants to do a long-form profile, full weekend spread, and the producers from 60 Minutes asked if you'd consider a sit-down pre-election cycle." Jasmine stirred her tea slowly, not looking up. "What's changed?" she asked. Talia smiled. "Apparently you're now what they call measured but magnetic." Jasmine raised an eyebrow. "Funny. I used to be unfiltered and unpredictable." That was the irony. The same tone they once tried to clip, trim, reframe, was now being sold as her signature. The same clarity that once made them uncomfortable was now being repackaged as a rare gift. She hadn't changed. The camera had. And not because it wanted to, but because it had to. Because viewers had started seeing her before the institutions were ready to frame her properly. Even the networks that had quietly passed on her months ago, documentary teams, podcast producers, bookers for panel shows, were circling back. One producer from a major streaming service, who had previously told Talia that Jasmine's tone might be hard to translate into Middle America markets, now called to say, "We might have misread her." Talia played the voicemail on speaker. Jasmine didn't smile. She just leaned back in her chair and said, "No. They read me just fine. They just didn't expect me to be readable to anyone else." This wasn't bitterness. It was clarity. She didn't need their validation. She'd already gotten the only one that mattered. From the girl in Tulsa, from the pastor who shook her hand without asking for a selfie, from every person who saw her not as a disruption to the moment, but as a correction to the pattern. One night, scrolling quietly through her mentions, Jasmine came across a short video edit posted by a teenage creator from Detroit. It was just 20 seconds long, a slow zoom on her face from the Ellen interview, her voice layered over with soft piano. The caption was simple. She didn't try to fit the frame. She made them widen it. Jasmine watched it twice, then set her phone down and stared at the ceiling. Not out of pride, out of peace. Because what mattered most wasn't that the media had finally come around. It was that she no longer needed them to. The Capitol looked the same. That was the strange part. Same marble floors polished to a quiet gleam, same mahogany doors with brass handles, same suited aides whispering into phones as they moved through the halls like streams of urgency. Nothing looked different, but Jasmine felt the shift immediately. The air wasn't colder. It was calculated. People didn't avoid her. They just paused a beat longer before greeting her, as if recalibrating their tone, unsure which version of her they were supposed to address now. Not the young rising star, not the viral moment, but something else, something they didn't have a label for yet, and that unsettled them more than they let on. She walked through the Longworth building with the calm she always carried, but her eyes scanned like radar. A fellow congressman who used to greet her with a pat on the back and a booming "Texas in the house" now offered a nod that didn't quite reach his eyes. A senior staffer from a major committee avoided eye contact entirely when passing in the hall. In meetings, she noticed the small delays before her suggestions were acknowledged. The way ideas she floated were often repeated 5 minutes later in someone else's voice, only to be credited to them. It wasn't hostility, it was strategy. They couldn't challenge her openly, so they opted for erosion instead. Slow, silent, and entirely deniable. She didn't say anything. She didn't need to. She'd walked into too many rooms where resistance wore a tie and smiled at the door. But she felt it, and she knew what it was. Punishment by omission. A quiet kind of backlash not designed to stop her, but to slow her down, to remind her that while she had won the moment, the machine hadn't forgotten. Later that week, in a subcommittee meeting on judicial equity reform, she delivered her opening remarks with the same crisp clarity she always brought. But when she finished, the chair, a man who had praised her energy just months ago, offered a bland thank you and immediately shifted to another member, skipping the usual courtesy of dialogue. Jasmine sat back, folded her notes, and said nothing. But she saw it. The glances passed between staffers, the slight tightening of jaws, the discomfort that came not from disagreement, but from being reminded that her presence could no longer be managed the way it used to. In the cloakroom, a junior colleague leaned toward her, voice low. "They're saying you made Ellen uncomfortable on purpose." Jasmine turned to him, expression unreadable. "Did they ever ask why that made them uncomfortable?" He said nothing. She didn't expect him to. That night, back in her apartment overlooking Pennsylvania Avenue, Jasmine stared out at the city lights and tried to name the feeling in her chest. It wasn't regret. It wasn't fear. It was a kind of weighted calm, the clarity that comes from knowing you didn't flinch, even when it would have been easier to just smile, nod, and walk off stage with the applause. She sipped her tea slowly, the cup warm in her hand, the rest of the apartment quiet except for the low hum of traffic far below. And still, she replayed the looks, the silences, the strategically polite dismissals. Not because she needed to relive them, but because she needed to remember them. Power doesn't always vanish with volume. Sometimes it recoils in silence and waits for you to stumble. But Jasmine wasn't stumbling. She was anchoring. The first letter came in a plain white envelope with no return address. It wasn't threatening, at least not directly. Just 7 typed sentences, no signature, no greeting. "You're not as untouchable as you think. The Ellen thing won't protect you forever. Don't confuse popularity with power." Jasmine read it once, then set it aside without a word. Talia, who filtered most of the office's mail before it ever reached Jasmine's desk, found 3 more in the same style over the next 2 weeks. Some subtle, some not. None surprising. Jasmine didn't talk about them publicly. She didn't call a press conference or file a complaint. She knew how these things worked. Sometimes the threat wasn't the point, it was the reminder, a signal that someone out there, or more likely several someones, were watching, waiting, hoping she'd trip, that she'd grow tired, that she'd quiet down, not out of defeat, but exhaustion. But if the private pressure tried to shrink her, the public ripples told a different story. At an elementary school in Atlanta, a 3rd-grade teacher wrote to say her class had watched Jasmine's Ellen interview during a social studies unit on media and messaging. The kids didn't understand everything, the teacher admitted, but they felt it. One little girl turned to me afterward and said, "She talked like my mom does when no one listens." At a women's re-entry center in St. Louis, a formerly incarcerated mother posted a photo holding a printed quote from Jasmine's speech. "Respect isn't volume. It's whether people stop talking long enough to listen." The caption read, "For the first time, I feel like someone speaks how I think." And then there were the whispers, the texts, the elevator moments, from staffers, from interns, even from opponents who pulled Jasmine aside with a glance over the shoulder, just long enough to say, "That thing you did, that mattered more than you know." Some of them wouldn't say it out loud. Not yet. Not in committee. Not where cameras could see. But it was beginning. Not a wave, not a movement, just a shift. Quiet, like pressure before a break. Talia noticed it too. "They still won't say it on the record," she said over lunch one day, "but they're following you now. Even the ones who hated the clip, they're adjusting to the idea that you can't be ignored anymore." Jasmine stirred her tea without looking up. "They'll try to outlast it. They'll wait for the next fire." Talia nodded. "Maybe. But I think they're starting to realize you're not a fire, you're a fault line. Jasmine didn't smile at that, but something behind her eyes flickered. Not pride, not victory, just recognition of the truth, of the cost. She'd had to cancel 2 speaking engagements due to anonymous threats. Security had been quietly increased at her district office. One aide quit unexpectedly, citing family concerns, and yet she kept showing up. Floor votes, hearings, town halls, no fanfare, no entourage, just presence. That was what unnerved them most. She hadn't flamed out. She hadn't cashed in. She hadn't morphed into a pundit or a provocateur. She'd stayed the same, clear, calm, unbending, and the longer she stayed that way, the more the system revealed itself, not through confrontation, but through reaction. Late one night, after a long markup session on prison reform, Jasmine returned to her office to find a sticky note left on her desk. It was written in sharp black ink and in handwriting she didn't recognize. It read, "Keep standing. I heard you. We all did. No name, no initials, no context. But Jasmine didn't need one. Some echoes didn't need to be loud to be lasting. It started with a clip. Not the full Ellen segment, just 18 seconds. No music, no text. Just Jasmine's face, her voice steady, saying, "Respect isn't volume. It's whether people stop talking long enough to listen." Someone posted it late one night without tagging her, without asking for shares. And yet it traveled, quietly at first, like a song hummed under breath, then louder, picked up by teachers, by nonprofit leaders, by nurses and factory workers and retired postal clerks. It landed in inboxes, in group chats, in comment sections filled with words like, "Finally, this, and I needed this today." Jasmine didn't track the numbers. She didn't count likes or views, but Talia did. She watched as the clip quietly crossed the 1 million view threshold, then 5, then 12, without ever being boosted by an official account. No marketing push, no influencer campaign, just people passing it to people. And the people it reached, they weren't pundits. They weren't political strategists. They were women who worked night shifts, men who raised daughters on their own, teenagers who had never spoken up in class because they were told their tone was too sharp, janitors who had been told to watch their attitude, immigrants who had learned to smile before speaking to avoid being labeled angry. They weren't clapping. They weren't shouting. They were nodding and whispering to themselves, "Me too." One morning, Jasmine walked into her office to find a package waiting. No label, no sender. Inside was a framed photo collage. 12 faces, different ages, different states, all women, each one holding a handwritten sign with Jasmine's words. At the bottom, one of them had written in blue marker, "We speak." "You echo." Jasmine stared at the frame for a long time. She didn't cry, but she didn't move either. Later that week, Talia showed her a compilation video. It was stitched together by someone in Chicago, a student, judging by the username. It opened with Jasmine on Ellen, then Alondra's town hall moment, then the pastor's handshake, then news anchors, teachers, even small-town radio DJs quoting her line. Not for hype, not for spin, but for grounding. As if her voice had become a kind of compass for people trying to stand upright in a world that rewarded bending. And still, Jasmine hadn't given a follow-up interview, hadn't sat down with 60 Minutes, hadn't launched a hashtag. She had simply continued showing up, in hearings, in classrooms, in shelters, in meetings about zoning laws and school lunch programs. Places no camera would ever glamorize. And somehow that had made her message louder, because while others searched for spotlight, she had become the signal. In one committee hearing, a freshman congresswoman from a swing district, someone who had once publicly distanced herself from Jasmine, quoted her during floor debate. "We must be careful not to mistake volume for clarity," she said, paraphrasing, eyes briefly meeting Jasmine's across the chamber. She didn't nod, she didn't smile, but the words had landed, and in that small, silent exchange, Jasmine realized something. She wasn't walking alone. She never really had. It just took a moment of stillness to reveal how many others had been walking too. Quietly, deliberately, waiting for someone to step forward first, not to lead them, but to remind them they were already moving. It didn't happen with a headline. It didn't come from a vote count or a committee assignment or even a viral montage. It came slowly, like weather shifting without announcement. A subtle realignment of posture in the rooms Jasmine entered. The way people now leaned forward instead of sideways when she spoke. No longer a curiosity, no longer a flashpoint, just a presence that shaped the terms of the room. And that was the real change. Not that Jasmine had become louder, but that the space around her had finally grown quiet enough to hear her at her natural volume. Her influence was no longer transactional. It didn't hinge on retweets or endorsements. It was relational, ambient, built in the pauses between her words and the reactions they stirred. A silent infrastructure of credibility that didn't need defending. She didn't rush to correct misquotes anymore. She didn't scramble to be understood. She let the misunderstanding happen, knowing that clarity would arrive without her effort. That was the strange gift of surviving the spotlight without bending to it. You stopped chasing control, and in that surrender, you found real weight. At a policy summit in Chicago, Jasmine sat on a panel with 3 other Congress members, all male, all senior, all previously dismissive. The moderator asked a pointed question about media representation in politics. The others answered first, carefully worded, vaguely inspirational, heavy on statistics and light on vulnerability. When it came to Jasmine, she paused, then simply said, "Representation isn't the picture you paint. It's the frame you choose not to erase." The audience didn't erupt. It exhaled. Later, one of the panelists approached her off stage and said, "You know, I used to think you were reckless." He didn't say what he thought now. He didn't have to. Even the media had shifted in tone. Long-form profiles no longer tried to contain her in one word. Outspoken, unapologetic, blunt. Now they leaned into nuance. One piece called her a politician who listens like a therapist and speaks like a poet holding a scalpel. Another described her not as a lightning rod, but as the calm before someone else's reckoning. But Jasmine didn't linger in those pieces. She didn't correct them, didn't repost them, didn't use them for campaign material. She simply continued. District meetings, late-night calls with advocacy groups, hours with public defenders and school board reps and domestic violence counselors. Her calendar was still full, but it was no longer about being seen. It was about seeing. In one closed-door meeting with young organizers in Phoenix, a high school student asked her what the hardest part of being heard had been. Jasmine took a breath and answered without blinking. "Convincing people that I was speaking for more than just myself." That was the quiet truth. Her voice had become familiar, but it had never been singular. It was stitched together from stories handed to her in parking lots, and whispered in food bank lines and scribbled in letters that started with, "You don't know me, but..." She had never claimed to be a movement, but she had made herself movable, accessible, unshakable. And in doing so, she had become the kind of leader who didn't just raise volume, she raised thresholds. What people tolerated, what they normalized, what they accepted as just how things are. That was her legacy, already forming, already felt, even before anyone had dared call it that. Not by declaration, but by gravity. It was an overcast Thursday afternoon in D.C., the kind where the light falls flat and the air feels like it's holding its breath. Jasmine had just stepped out of a subcommittee hearing on housing equity, her blazer slung over her arm, her phone buzzing with reminders she hadn't looked at in hours. She was halfway down the Capitol steps, lost in thought, when she saw her. A girl, maybe 16, maybe 17. Standing just beyond the barricades, holding a hand-painted sign. No press badge, no megaphone, no crowd, just her. Jeans slightly too short, backpack slung over one shoulder, curly hair pinned back like she was trying to look older, but didn't quite know how. She stood with both feet planted, arms steady, sign lifted to chest level. Jasmine squinted to read it. "I'm the next angry one from Texas." No hashtags, no explanation. Just that. The words hit Jasmine harder than she expected. Not because they were loud, but because they were right. Not defiant, not mocking. Just true. Raw. A statement that carried 1,000 conversations in one sentence. Jasmine paused at the bottom of the steps. People passed around her. Staffers, interns, lobbyists, tourists. But she didn't move. She didn't speak. She just looked. The girl didn't wave, didn't smile. She just held her sign a little higher, like she needed it to be seen fully before anything else happened. Her eyes met Jasmine's for only a second, but in that second, Jasmine saw it all. The exhaustion, the clarity, the decision to stop waiting for permission to speak. She had seen that look in mirrors before committee hearings. She had seen it in Alondra's eyes, in Glenda Ruiz's email, in the face of a pastor who didn't need to say his name to leave a mark. And now it was standing there, holding cardboard, daring the world to look away. Jasmine stepped forward, slowly. No cameras followed, no security hovered, just her heels clicking against the stone until she stopped a few feet away. The girl didn't flinch. Jasmine gestured gently at the sign. "You made that?" The girl nodded. "Yeah." "You from Dallas?" "San Antonio." Jasmine smiled. "Close enough." They stood there for a moment, no longer politician and citizen, no longer public figure and admirer, just two people who understood that truth doesn't always need a podium. Jasmine glanced back toward the building, then turned again to the girl. "You keep that sign," she said. "There'll be days when they'll try to convince you to fold it, or rewrite it, or make it softer. Don't." The girl's grip tightened slightly. "Because anger," Jasmine continued, "when rooted in truth and channeled into change, isn't destruction. It's direction." The girl blinked hard, her throat visibly tightening. She didn't say thank you. She didn't have to. The moment wasn't for performance. It was a passing of something quiet and sacred, a baton made not of praise but of proof. As Jasmine turned to leave, the girl called after her. Not loud, not timid, just enough to be heard. "Congresswoman," Jasmine paused. "I saw the interview," the girl said. "You didn't yell, but it was the loudest thing I've ever heard." Jasmine turned slightly, nodded once, and walked on. Behind her, the girl didn't move. She held the sign high as if to remind the city it couldn't forget what it never fully saw in the first place. And for the first time in a long time, Jasmine didn't feel the weight of being the only one. She felt the rise of the next. The next morning was quiet, not the kind of quiet that came from lack of news, but the rare stillness that follows a moment where everything that needed to be said had already been spoken. Jasmine sat by the window of her apartment as the city woke up around her. Horns in the distance, the low churn of morning talk radio, the occasional siren weaving through traffic. She didn't check her phone. She didn't flip on the news. She just watched as sunlight stretched across the stone buildings, and the world moved forward, not knowing it had just shifted slightly under its own weight. There were no new interviews scheduled, no speaking engagements to rehearse for. Her inbox was full of media requests, editorials, podcast pitches, foundation offers. Talia had sorted them into folders: important, tactical, emotional, ignore. Jasmine hadn't opened any of them, not out of protest, but because she knew what they all wanted: a conclusion, a message, a branded takeaway they could quote, dissect, argue about. But she had already given them all the words they needed. Everything else would just be repetition. And legacies, the kind that last, aren't shaped by repetition. They're shaped by refusal. That morning, instead of writing a tweet or drafting a response or calling a press team, Jasmine brewed tea, opened a book of Baldwin essays, and read without underlining. She wasn't planning her next moment. She was making space for the next voice. Because that's what power does when it's fully claimed. It moves aside not to disappear, but to allow room for others to appear whole. Later that day, as she walked through Union Station on her way to catch the train back to Texas, she passed a young woman sitting cross-legged on the floor near the marble columns. She was maybe 20, headphones in, sketching something in a spiral-bound notebook. As Jasmine passed, the woman glanced up briefly, then back down, but did a double-take. Her face lit up, not with fanfare, but with quiet recognition. She didn't wave. She didn't interrupt. She just mouthed the words. "I heard you." Jasmine smiled and nodded. That was enough, because this was never about creating noise. It was about building resonance. And resonance, unlike reaction, doesn't need volume. It needs space. It needs silence wide enough for someone else's truth to echo through. Jasmine hadn't just told her story, she had opened a room, and now others were stepping into that room, some cautiously, some with conviction, some still trembling from years of being told their tone was too sharp, their voice too angry, their presence too much. But they were stepping in, and they were staying. Back in her district days later, Jasmine attended a small neighborhood forum about transportation equity. No press, no fanfare, just folding chairs and a community whiteboard. Halfway through, a middle-aged woman stood up, voice low but steady, and said, "I've never spoken in front of a room like this, but if Congresswoman Crockett can hold her ground on national TV, I can hold mine right here." No one clapped. They didn't need to. They just listened. And that's how Jasmine knew. The legacy wasn't in what she said. It was in how people listened after, in the space they made for others, in the silence they no longer feared. True strength isn't always loud. Sometimes it's the calm refusal to be diminished, even when silence is expected. Jasmine Crockett taught us that you don't have to shout to be heard. You just have to stand, fully present, and refuse to disappear. In a world that rewards compliance and punishes conviction, choosing to hold your ground can be the most radical act of all. So ask yourself, where in your life are you being asked to shrink? And what would happen if instead you stayed exactly as you are and simply said, "I'm still here"?